They said the casket was sealed tight, but every few miles, it would crack open, just slightly. It didn't stop until we passed the place she'd never truly left behind. It wasn't fear that made me stop the hearse. It was the quiet sound of wood shifting again, like something inside wanted one last look at the past. If something like this has ever happened to you, share it in the comments. I haven't been the same since that day. Some mornings press heavier than others. You can't always explain it, not with the checklist in your hands or the quiet hiss of the coffee machine that's already begun to cool before your second sip. It was one of those mornings. A Wednesday, I think. The kind that doesn't greet you. It just waits for you to show up and do your job. The sky hung low like it hadn't finished waking up, and the sun, when it finally rose, didn't so much shine as it loitered, diffused behind a veil of gray so pale it blurred the outlines of things. It wasn't raining, not exactly, but the air felt full, damp with the kind of weight you don't feel in your coat, but in your chest. I arrived at the funeral home just after 6, first to arrive, as usual. That silence in the prep room always settles around me like an old, robe-worn, familiar, unspoken. I went through the motions. Clipboards, keys, vehicle inspection. Tires looked good. Gas tank 3/4 full, windshield clear but streaked. The hearse was quiet, obedient. No hums, no clicks, no warning lights. The casket had been delivered the night before, simple maple finish with brass hinges that already felt dulled by time. No ornamentation, no velvet inlays, nothing extravagant. It was the kind of box that doesn't ask for attention, just does what it was made to do, carry something sacred and do it without complaint. I checked the interior straps and latches, tested the rear door twice, pressing firmly on the handle, then pulling. Locked, firm, no give. That part always matters more than most people realize. A loose latch isn't just a mechanical flaw, it's a breach of something deeper, a kind of trust. You don't just drive a hearse, you escort grief, and grief has a rhythm. I've learned to respect it like a river current. Don't fight it, don't rush it, just move with it, and hope it lets you pass through clean. The paperwork was thin that morning, just a single page with basic details. Female, 82, deceased of heart failure after a prolonged illness. Name redacted here for respect, though I remember it clearly. I always do. I don't memorize birthdays or socials, but names. Names stay, sometimes for years. The service was to be small. No limousines, no procession of floral vans. Just me, the hearse, and the daughter meeting us directly at the cemetery. Graveside only. The funeral director gave me a nod over his shoulder and said, "No frills, her wishes." I've heard that phrase more often than I'd like. Sometimes it means simplicity. Sometimes it means detachment. I slipped behind the wheel and let the engine turn over. It hummed smooth and low, like a throat clearing in a cathedral. The sky outside was the same color as old ash. I adjusted the mirror and sat still for a moment, longer than usual. Something in the quiet wasn't settling right. Not fear, I've long since buried that. Not dread either, just a thin line of awareness, like an itch along the spine you can't quite reach. I ignored it. I'd done this hundreds of times. Thousands, if you count the runs where no one showed up. Some jobs carry noise. This one carries weight. You learn to tell the difference. The funeral director and I wheeled the casket out together. It wasn't heavy, some aren't. There's a strange humility in that, a reminder that what makes a person feel enormous in life vanishes quickly in death. We slid it into place with practiced care. I checked the rubber pads, secured the straps, locked the rollers, pulled the latch and closed the rear door, pressed until I heard the click, then tested it again. One last walk around. Tires still good, backlight functioning, and then I was off. As the hearse rolled out onto the empty road, the early traffic hadn't yet begun its rush. There was a stillness on the street, the kind you get just before the world remembers it's supposed to move. I turned onto Main Street, heading toward Clearview Road, It's a route I've taken more times than I can count. Familiar, automatic, like breathing. But even then, as the tires hummed softly over the asphalt, the weight in the air never lifted. It just sat there beside me, quiet, patient, like a passenger I hadn't invited. Usually I fill this part of the drive with static from the radio or the soft whir of the heater. Not this time. I kept everything off. No noise, no distractions. The quiet felt too intentional to disturb. Out of habit, I glanced in the rearview mirror, not out of fear, just routine. Nothing but the outline of the casket behind me, resting steady, unmoving. But I kept watching it longer than usual. There was something about its presence that demanded it, like I needed to keep an eye on it, not out of suspicion, but respect. 10 minutes into the drive, I noticed something odd. Not visual, not sound, just a shift. Like the weight in the back had changed by a degree too small to name, but enough that my hands readjusted on the wheel without me realizing. I chalked it up to the road. There's a small dip near Milner Bridge that sometimes unsettles the suspension, just enough to feel like a bump in the chest. But even after I passed it, the sensation lingered. The hearse didn't feel off. The ride wasn't rough, but something somewhere felt subtly ajar. Still, I pressed on. That's what you do in this line of work. You keep moving forward, no matter what you feel, no matter how heavy the silence gets. You follow the route, follow the rules, and carry what must be carried until the final handoff. That's the contract. That's the oath. But by the time I made the next turn, the feeling had grown colder. Not in temperature, in presence. Like something behind me wasn't resting, not entirely. And still, I kept driving. I'd been told ahead of time not to expect much from the family. That wasn't uncommon. Some services are bursting at the seams with distant cousins. Floral arrangements stacked so high, they form a wall of color and scent around the dead. Others arrive quietly, with just enough people to lift the box and say a few words before fading back into the fog of their own lives. This one leaned toward the latter, maybe even further than that. There wasn't going to be a procession, no limousines or church hymns, no readings of poems half remembered from a school recital decades ago, just a graveside burial. In and out. I was told there was one next of kin handling the arrangements. Her daughter. I'd never met her, but her signature was on the form authorizing transport, service type, and casket selection. She had chosen the maple box. No satin interior, no brass handles, just the standard wooden grip and the quiet polish that looked almost matte under certain lights. The kind of casket a person picks when they want the entire process to be over with quickly, with minimal attention. Practical. Final. We crossed paths briefly that morning, just before I closed the rear door of the hearse. She had arrived in a plain sedan, dark green and coated in the kind of road dust that never quite goes away in this part of the state. Her hair was short, businesslike, cut with that no-nonsense style that always made me think of real estate agents and legal aids. She didn't wear black, just a gray blouse under a long wool coat and a pair of dark slacks. No jewelry that I could see. Her eyes met mine for less than a second, a flick of acknowledgement, then turned down to her phone. She didn't approach the hearse, didn't touch the casket. She stood to the side, speaking softly into her screen about scheduling and rescheduling. Something about a meeting next week, the details blurred under the low growl of a delivery truck 2 blocks away. When she ended the call, she sighed loud, sharp, and stared at the sidewalk as if trying to remember what came next. I watched from the corner of my eye as she scrolled through something else, then slipped her phone into her pocket, arms folding instinctively. It was the body language of someone who'd been dreading this moment, not because of pain, but because of inconvenience. The funeral director approached her to confirm the destination and timing. She answered with a flat, unblinking tone, nodding at all the right beats, but never once glancing toward the hearse. She didn't ask how her mother had been prepared, whether the hair was combed, or if the dress fit properly. She didn't mention music or readings or anyone else who might be joining. When asked if there would be other mourners, she simply shook her head. "No one left," she said, and that was it. That phrase stuck with me for longer than I'd expected. No one left. Not no one could come, or just me. It was stated as fact, as final accounting, a closing of the book, not just on a person, but on a legacy. I've driven enough services to know that grief doesn't always manifest the way people think it should. Some daughters wail and collapse into the earth itself. Others stare with dry eyes and clenched jaws, mourning in silence for months. But this woman, she wasn't mourning. She was managing, executing, checking boxes. I'd seen people cry for dogs with more visible emotion. When we departed the funeral home, she didn't follow immediately. She lingered near her car, scrolling again, checking the time. I passed her slowly, watching in the mirror as she adjusted her coat and eventually climbed into the driver's seat, pulling into the road behind me with the mechanical pace of someone heading to a meeting they didn't want to attend. There was no second car, no friend riding along, no pastor in a trailing vehicle, flipping through verses. Just her. As I merged onto the quieter stretch of road leading toward the cemetery, I tried to picture the woman in the casket. I hadn't known her name until that morning, hadn't seen her face, hadn't touched her hand, but now she was in my care, and the weight of that sat with me as tangibly as the wheel beneath my fingers. I wondered who she'd been, not in the grand biographical sense, but in the small ways that only a daughter would know. What she liked for breakfast, whether she hummed to herself while folding laundry, if she ever kept the closet door slightly open at night, or if she once told her daughter stories that made no sense, the kind you don't understand until years later, if ever. But none of that was written down. All I had was a name, an age, a cause of death, and a silent box that shifted slightly when the road curved left, and a daughter who had already looked away before the lid was fully closed. I glanced into the rear view again. The casket lay exactly as we left it. No movement, no visible change. But the air inside the hearse felt heavier now. Not dangerous, not evil, just full. Like the kind of silence that follows a child's question that no adult wants to answer. At a red light, I reached over to the passenger seat for the folder. A single sheet fluttered loose from the stack, sliding under the corner of the dashboard. I retrieved it without thinking and noticed something unexpected tucked behind the paperwork. A small photograph, yellowed at the edges, as if it had been pressed into a book and forgotten. It showed a house, modest, square, with peeling white siding and a wraparound porch that looked like it might not hold weight anymore. 2 trees stood in the yard, tall, brittle things with tangled branches. In the corner, handwritten in faded ink, Hickory Lane, 43. There was no explanation attached. No note, no caption. Just the house, still and silent, under what looked like an autumn sky. I flipped the photo over. The name written on the back matched the one on the casket manifest. I held it there for a moment, unsure what to make of it. Had it been slipped in by the daughter, left behind by a staff member? Maybe part of the belongings that were never claimed. I set it back in the folder carefully and resumed driving, but the image stayed with me, especially the window on the second floor, curtain drawn just wide enough to suggest someone once watched the world from that very spot. The casket hadn't moved again, at least not yet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone inside it remembered what that window looked like from the inside out. By the time I reached the old stretch of Millstone Road, the clouds had thickened overhead, folding into one another like layers of ash being stirred in cold water. This part of the drive was usually uneventful, long, straight, bordered by low fields on both sides. The kind of place where silence doesn't echo, because there's nothing for sound to bounce against. Just fields, fences, and the occasional windmill leaning like an old man too tired to stand upright. I'd driven this route dozens of times. It was familiar to me, almost muscle memory. I knew when to tap the brakes before the low dip under the rail trestle, and where to avoid the loose gravel that always spilled out after the rain. Nothing about the road had changed. But the quiet inside the hearse had begun to feel less like calm and more like tension held in a breath. The first sound came just before the second turned a slow bend to the right, where the trees leaned close enough to form a canopy when they are in full bloom. Today, they stood bare, spindly arms reaching across the sky, as if trying to touch something that no longer passed between them. As I eased into the curve, there was a faint clock behind me. Not loud, not alarming, but definite. I kept both hands on the wheel, eyes straight ahead, the reflexive tension running from my neck into my shoulders. I didn't brake suddenly. There was no reason to. It hadn't sounded like a problem. Not a flat tire, not a dropped strap or anything mechanical, but I still felt the need to stop. A pull not quite external, but not internal either. Like when you find yourself standing in a dark room and suddenly become aware that you're not alone, even though you see no one. That kind of knowing. I pulled over onto the shoulder, easing the hearse to a gentle stop. The gravel crunched beneath the tires, scattering beneath the weight. I killed the engine, but left the ignition on, just enough for the cabin to stay alive with a low hum of electricity. Then I opened the door slowly, letting the chill air seep in before stepping out. The wind wasn't sharp, but it carried the kind of cold that settles between your fingers and stays there even after you've closed your fists. I walked to the back of the hearse with deliberate steps, not rushed, but not dragging. The road was empty in both directions. I'd passed only one other car in the last 15 minutes, a rust-colored pickup parked beside an old barn, and now the silence out here was full and untouched. When I reached the rear door, I checked the handle. Still latched, no sign of damage. But when I pressed the release and lifted the hatch, I saw it immediately. The casket had shifted. It wasn't dramatic. No lid thrown open, no straps undone, just a misalignment. The lid had cracked open at the seam, maybe a centimeter, not enough for anyone else to notice. But I knew what it looked like when a casket was sealed properly, and this wasn't it. The lid had slipped, or lifted, or something. I stepped closer. The rollers beneath it hadn't moved, but the shift was real, like a sigh you almost don't hear until it's gone. I checked the straps first, still buckled, tight, no slack. Then I touched the lid gently, pressing it down with the flat of my palm. It gave easily, no resistance, no latch out of place. It simply eased back into place with a soft click. I pulled up again. It resisted. Good. Locked. Nothing visible was wrong. No damage to the wood, no splintering or misalignment. Everything looked as it should. Still, I stood there longer than I needed to. My fingers hovered over the edge of the lid. I wasn't afraid. That part of the job had long faded, but I felt something else. A pause in my own thoughts. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from the world around you, but from something inside the moment itself. I glanced at the nameplate affixed to the head of the casket. It was blank at the family's request, I remembered. No engraving, no name, just smooth, polished brass. A surface that gave back no information, only reflected your own face if you looked too closely. I didn't. After a final check, I closed the rear hatch, listening for the soft thump as it sealed again. I pulled on it to be sure. Locked, solid, no movement. I stood behind the hearse for another moment, watching the wind tease the dry grass along the roadside. Then I climbed back into the driver's seat and closed the door. Inside, the cabin felt colder, despite the fact I hadn't turned off the heat. I adjusted the mirror again. The casket sat still now, as if it hadn't moved, as if I'd imagined the whole thing. But I hadn't. That soft clock was real. That gap in the lid had been there. I turned the key. The engine came alive with a low rumble. I didn't speak aloud, never do, but I found myself lingering again, hand on the gear shift, before finally pulling back onto the road. Back in motion, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a latch hadn't caught properly at the funeral home. Maybe a shift in weight from the uneven road had nudged it just enough to open. Maybe the air pressure changed during the drive, causing the wood to flex. All plausible, all reasonable. And yet none of those explanations settled the way they should have. None of them accounted for the way it felt, the sound, the pause, the hush in the air, like something had paused along with me, holding its own breath. 15 minutes later, I was back into the rhythm of the drive. The radio remained off. The silence had taken on a kind of gravity, drawing every thought into itself like a well with no bottom. I passed the edge of town where the old textile mill used to stand, now reduced to concrete teeth and vines. The road narrowed slightly as the tree line crept in again. That same sense of unease rode with me, quiet but steady, like a song too soft to catch, but too persistent to ignore. And though I told myself I'd imagined it, though I promised myself it wouldn't happen again, I still found my eyes drifting to the mirror every few seconds, watching that box, listening, waiting, because deep down, I already knew it wasn't the last time it would move. There's a certain kind of repetition that settles into you when you've done the same job for long enough. Not boredom, not quite, but a rhythm you stop questioning. The wheels hum the same song against the pavement. The road markings flash by in a language only the familiar can read, and you begin to trust the patterns. You stop thinking and just move forward. That's the comfort in it, and sometimes the danger. Because when something shifts, even slightly, the mind may try to dismiss it, but the body remembers. And mine had not forgotten the first sound. I was about 15 minutes from where it first happened. The highway had widened, the fields opened up, and now the wind blew hard across the land without trees to slow it. The sky was still a dull, unmotivated gray, like a thought unfinished. I'd passed a long stretch of farmland and a forgotten schoolhouse with its windows boarded and ivy clinging like regret. The silence inside the hearse remained thick, but something else had joined it. I couldn't describe it yet, only that it felt more aware than before. Not hostile, not invasive, but present. My hand stayed steady on the wheel, but I found myself checking the rearview mirror with increasing frequency, even when nothing had changed. That kind of behavior creeps in slowly. You think you're just being thorough, cautious, professional, but in reality, you're waiting for the moment something happens again, so you can confirm you're not imagining it, so you can trust yourself. And then it did. The sound was the same. That subtle, unmistakable clock. Not like a strap tightening or a panel settling. No, it was organic. A shift. The sound of a lid moving just enough to speak without words. I didn't slam the brakes. That would have been a violation, not just of the road, but of the atmosphere that had formed around me like a cocoon. Instead, I gently coasted onto the gravel shoulder, letting the hearse roll to a soft stop. I shut off the engine, the silence blooming instantly, swallowing even the ticking of the cooling vents. The fields around me were flat and endless. No homes in sight, just fence posts and the occasional crow landing like punctuation on an otherwise blank sentence. The wind pushed softly against the side of the hearse, not enough to sway it, but enough to be felt in the fingertips gripping the door handle. I stepped out again. The cold was deeper now, though the temperature hadn't changed. I walked around to the back, my boots crunched over scattered grit and dry weeds. I stood there for a moment, hand on the latch, staring at the rear door as if it might blink first. Then I opened it. This time, there was no doubt. The casket had shifted again, not just a centimeter closer to 2. The lid had eased open more obviously now, not violently, no cracking or splintering, just open, like the gentle turn of a page in a book too old to protest. The straps were still tight, the rollers untouched, no movement in the wheelbase, but the seam was no longer flush. That faint line, barely perceptible earlier, had widened, and I could now see the soft edge of the inner lining beneath the lid. It was wrong, not in a mechanical sense. Everything was working. The hardware hadn't failed. Nothing had given way. But it was wrong in the way a mirror sometimes shows something you didn't see with your own eyes. It didn't belong not in the order I had established, not in the rhythm of the day. I pressed the lid down again. It slid back into place without resistance, like a door closing behind someone who never wanted to be followed. The click came late, but sure. I waited until I heard it twice. This time, I didn't just test the seal. I opened the side panel of the hearse and pulled out a spare nylon strap, the kind we usually reserve for uneven roads or emergency reinforcement. I looped it across the casket and locked it down. Tight, but not disrespectful. I didn't want to give the impression I was containing something, only securing it, offering assurance, not imprisonment. Before I closed the hatch, I glanced again at the brass nameplate. Still blank, still smooth. But now, the reflection in it seemed different. The distortion of the sky behind me, the curve of the field, it all bent just slightly wrong. Like the air had rippled, like heat rising from asphalt even though the ground was cold. I shut the hatch gently and stood back, took in the scene. Wind moving through the fence lines. A single black bird staring from the wire. No other vehicles. No sign of life except what I brought with me. And whatever stayed with me, back in the driver's seat, I sat without starting the engine. I looked at the photo again, still tucked under the folder. Hickory Lane, 43. The ink hadn't smudged, though the edges had curled inward, like a paper trying to protect its own secret. I stared at the house. It had that familiar look, a memory you don't recognize, but still feel in your bones. I didn't know why it was there, or who had placed it, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. It meant something, not for me, for her, and whatever was causing the lid to shift, it wasn't random. I started the engine. The hearse hummed back to life, and the vibration ran beneath me like a pulse. The road stretched ahead, and I returned to it slowly. But now, I drove with a new awareness, not just of what was behind me, but of what it might be trying to see. The rest of the drive toward the refueling station was uneventful, at least on the surface. But my mind churned quietly. I scanned every bump, every rise in the pavement, for a mechanical reason. A latch misalignment, maybe a torsion in the frame that caused tension to release under just the right motion. But every theory felt like scaffolding erected over something older, something softer, something less technical, and more emotional. When I pulled into the small station just outside Dunridge, I took longer than I needed to. I stepped out slowly, the pump clattering in my hand as I swiped the card. The sky was beginning to lighten slightly at the edges, like the clouds had decided to reconsider their dominance. I looked into the back window of the hearse as the gas clicked steadily into the tank. The casket was still, for now, but that didn't comfort me. Not anymore. The fuel pump clicked once loud, sharp pulling me out of my own mind, like a door slamming in an empty house. I removed the nozzle, returned it to its cradle, and tightened the cap with the same mechanical motion I performed 100 times. The small station was quiet, no music from the speakers, no chatter from inside, just the faint buzz of refrigeration units, humming behind the brick wall, and a plastic flag tied to the roof, fluttering in the breeze like a thing forgotten. Back inside the hearse, the cabin felt unchanged. Same gray light slanting through the windshield, same low murmur of the heater, pushing stale warmth over the dashboard. But the silence had matured. It no longer felt merely still. It felt expected. I sat with it for a moment, hand on the gear shift, eyes tracing the edge of the glove compartment, and to the passenger seat, where the folder still rested. I reached for it again, not because I needed anything from it, but because I didn't want to be idle. There's a certain kind of movement that feels safer than stillness, even when it accomplishes nothing. The documents inside hadn't changed. Same transport authorization, same brief overview of the deceased, same signature from the daughter Sharp, slanted, written with purpose, but no tenderness. But then the photo slipped out. Again, it had wedged itself slightly between the pages this time, curling at one corner, like it had tried to stay hidden, but failed. I held it gently, careful not to smudge the surface. The image was simple, almost painfully so a house, modest and weather-worn, with a porch that sagged slightly at one end. The siding was chipped, white flaking away to reveal the aged gray beneath. 2 windows at the front, one shutter crooked, the other missing entirely. A tree stood on either side, not full enough to be called shade trees, but tall enough to loom. There was no figure in the photo, no date stamp, no vehicles, no signs of life at all. It might have been taken 10 years ago, or 30. It might have been abandoned, or still lived in. But the moment I looked at it, I felt something I didn't have a name for. Not nostalgia. I'd never seen this place before. Not fear, exactly. Something more private than that. Like I'd walked into a room where someone had just left, and the air hadn't yet settled. I turned it over again. The handwriting on the back was unmistakable firm, slightly shaky with age, but deliberate. It read, Hickory Lane, 43, and beneath it, in the same hand, do not forget. There was no mistaking the name just below that. The same as the one on the paperwork, now lying quiet in the back of my vehicle. I stared at that name longer than I meant to. It had been typed in forms, printed on labels, logged in manifests. But here, in pen deliberate, human, personal, it landed differently, like a whisper pressed into the page. I thought about the daughter, standing with her arms folded, eyes always looking past things instead of at them. I remembered how she hadn't so much as glanced at the casket when I loaded it, how her voice carried the cadence of someone reciting a grocery list, rather than preparing to bury the woman who raised her. And I thought of this photo, placed deliberately into the file by someone her mother, perhaps before the end. Do not forget. I set the picture down on the seat beside me, letting it face upward. The house stared back. My eyes drifted toward the route ahead, and without meaning to, I pulled out my phone and checked the map. Hickory Lane still existed. It was a small road off a rural loop that ran parallel to the cemetery route. I'd passed within 2 miles of it during countless funerals over the years, but never once turned down it. According to the map, it dead-ended just past number 43, no through traffic. Just fields, trees, and a few scattered homes that had probably outlived the hands that built them. I considered adjusting the route. I didn't know why not exactly. There was no logical reason. My job was to deliver the deceased to the cemetery, not indulge the mysteries they left behind. But something about the way that photo had appeared, then reappeared, unsettled the parameters of my usual detachment. And there was the other thing. The sound. Twice now. That soft, deliberate movement of the casket. Twice I'd stopped, checked, reinforced. And twice it had seemed as though something inside had resisted being fully closed. I hadn't told anyone yet. No reason to. The daughter wouldn't have cared. The funeral director might have offered a raised eyebrow, maybe a story of his own to match it, and then we'd both go back to work. No, this was mine to carry. As most things are in this profession, the weight doesn't end with the casket. Sometimes it starts there. I reached for the ignition again, letting the engine turn over slowly. Before shifting into drive, I placed the photograph upright in the center console, wedging it between 2 folded receipts. It sat there, quiet, watching, like it had always belonged in that space. As I pulled away from the station and back onto the county road, I kept one eye on the rearview mirror. The casket was still. The strap remained taut. No creaks, no shudders. Just the steady hum of tires rolling over worn pavement. But I knew it wasn't over. Not yet. Somewhere ahead, the house waited. And I had the growing sense that the passenger I carried wasn't quite ready to rest until we passed it. The road narrowed as I approached the final stretch toward the cemetery. The map said 15 minutes, maybe less, but time had already begun to fold in on itself, losing the clean edges it normally held between fuel stops and arrival windows. I couldn't tell if I'd been on the road an hour or a lifetime. The clouds hadn't moved much. The sky remained the same colorless dome it had been since morning. But now, with the engine's steady vibration beneath me, it felt heavier closer. I drove slower than I needed to, not because of traffic or road conditions, but because the silence inside the hearse was thickening again. It had grown quieter somehow, as if whatever had been shifting earlier was now listening, waiting, holding something back. The photograph sat exactly where I left it, balanced upright in the center console. The edges had curled a little more, and the ink on the back hickory lane, 43, seemed to press harder against the paper, as if time had deepened it. I glanced at it without turning my head, just the barest movement of my eyes. The house stared back, its windows still dark, porch still slumped, trees still framing it like sentinels. It wasn't just a structure anymore, it had become something, weighted, anchored, a fixed point toward which the entire day seemed to be tilting. I reached the last major curve before the long cemetery road. It bent sharply left, a wide arc around an overgrown cornfield, the kind of turn that never felt dangerous, but always asked for your attention. I slowed more than usual, my foot easing onto the brake as I coasted in. That's when it happened again. The sound was louder this time, not just a cluck, but a subtle, dragging groan. Wood over metal, weight shifting with resistance. It didn't happen fast. It unfolded, slowly, deliberately, like something turning over in sleep. I didn't slam the brakes. I didn't need to. The hearse was already gliding at a crawl, but my pulse spiked, a low throb in my throat and wrists, and I felt the air around me compress, as if the space inside the cabin had shrunk by inches. I pulled onto the gravel shoulder without thinking. Same motion, same crunch beneath the tires. But this time, I left the engine running. I didn't want full silence. I stepped out quickly, my boots hitting the ground harder than intended, and walked to the back. No wind now, no movement in the trees. The world around me had stilled, like a held breath. I reached for the rear latch, hesitating for the first time. Not out of fear, but out of reverence. The kind you feel before opening something old and sacred, not because you fear what's inside, but because you know it was never meant to be disturbed. I lifted the door and froze. The casket had opened again, but this time it wasn't a crack or a centimeter. The lid had lifted a full 2 inches, enough to see the edge of the interior lining cream fabric gathered neatly along the border, slightly compressed where the lid had risen. The strap I'd secured was still locked. It hadn't failed. It hadn't even loosened. It now sat slightly off angle, still tight, but unable to prevent the upward shift. The hinge hadn't broken. The seal hadn't snapped. It was as if the wood itself had breved upward, as if pressure from within had nudged it open, not with force, but with need. I didn't touch it at first. I just stared. My breath had shortened without me realizing. My fingers hung loose at my sides. I looked for logical explanations. Buckle slippage, compression shifts, vibration along uneven roadbeds. But none of it accounted for the fact that the latch hadn't disengaged, the rollers hadn't moved, and the air now smelled different. It wasn't rot, nothing foul, nothing sick. It was sweet, faint, subtle, like vanilla, no closer to sugar, warm and gentle, like something baked. A scent that didn't belong on a country roadside next to a fallow field and an aging hearse. It reminded me of something homemade, something old-fashioned. The scent of a childhood kitchen, maybe. A cake just pulled from the oven on a Sunday afternoon. There was cinnamon in it, I was almost sure, and something else, something soft, like almond or clove. I found myself blinking slowly, trying to separate the physical from the impossible. But the scent was real. It drifted forward like memory, pressing gently against my face, entering through my nose, and curling behind my eyes until it wasn't just a smell, it was a presence. I stepped closer to the casket, placing one hand lightly on the lid. It didn't resist. It didn't push back, but it didn't close either. It rested there, open just enough to suggest a question that no one had been brave or foolish enough to answer. I whispered, before I realized I had spoken. "I'm taking you there." The words left my mouth without planning, without structure. I wasn't speaking to the casket. I wasn't speaking to myself. I was simply speaking, as if something between us had settled into a shared understanding that whatever was happening, whatever had opened the lid 3 times, Now wasn't malfunction, wasn't accident. It was longing. I pressed the lid gently down, guiding it rather than forcing it. It lowered without a sound, smooth and graceful, as if it had simply been waiting for permission. The strap aligned again, firm, but not strained. I checked the rear door before closing it. Locked, solid. The wind picked up for the first time in what felt like hours, brushing against my shoulder, bringing with it a few dry leaves that danced briefly across the hood before vanishing into the field. I returned to the driver's seat and closed the door slowly. The heater was still blowing faintly through the vents. The photograph in the console had tilted slightly forward. I adjusted it upright again. I looked at the map. Hickory Lane was still 2 turns away. I didn't hesitate. I reached the upcoming junction and turned off the main road, away from the cemetery route, heading east through narrow, winding stretches of rural blacktop I hadn't driven in years. Trees thickened on both sides. Houses thinned. The pavement cracked more with each mile, as if the road itself had aged along with the memories tied to it. As I turned onto Hickory Lane, the wind stopped again. The air grew dense, and in the mirror behind me, the casket was finally still. But something in me knew. She was watching, waiting, and for the first time all day, the silence no longer felt heavy. It felt ready. Hickory Lane began the way all forgotten roads do, narrow, cracked, and slightly bowed in the middle from years of trucks too heavy and winters too long. There was no shoulder to speak of, just patches of dead grass and gravel that gave way to ditches on either side. The trees pressed close now, their bare limbs tangled overhead, forming a kind of ribcage above the road. A tunnel of branches, leafless and thin, through which light barely filtered. The farther I drove, the more the world behind me seemed to withdraw, shrinking into a blur of fields and roots and rituals that no longer applied here. I didn't check the time. It felt irrelevant. I didn't wonder what the daughter would think, whether she'd arrive at the cemetery first and call someone to complain about the delay. I didn't even consider the burial director, or the schedule, or the subtle violation of my assigned route. That part of my mind had gone quiet. There was only this stretch of road now, only this house, and the woman I carried. The photograph sat on the console beside me, now curling at 2 corners, the edges softening as if they too were surrendering to age. The house stared back from the image, weathered, quiet, dignified, in the way only places can be when no one looks at them for years. I didn't need the number anymore. I knew where it would be. I recognized the outline of the trees, the slope of the yard, the angle of the roofline in the same way one recognizes the voice of someone long gone by feel, not by memory. I slowed the hearse as the house came into view. It was exactly as the photo had promised. A 2-story farmhouse with peeling white paint and black shutters. The one hung loose and crooked like a tired eyelid. The porch sagged in the middle, a half-collapsed swing still tethered to one rusted chain. The front yard was mostly weeds and soil, except for 2 thin rows of bricks that marked what once must have been a path. No car in the driveway, no sign of movement. Just the house, breathing in its own way, absorbing the cold daylight in silence. I brought the hearse to a full stop just before the gate, or what remained of it. The hinges were gone. The wooden slats leaned outward like they'd been pushed one too many times by a child in a hurry. I turned off the engine. A sudden absence of vibration left a hollow in my chest. I sat in the stillness, not moving. Not yet. Something had shifted the moment the house appeared. Not outside, but inside the hearse. The air behind me felt different, not cold, not heavy, just aware, present in a way it hadn't been all morning. The casket had stopped moving after the last turn. No creaks, no groans, no subtle lifting. And now, parked here, just feet from the house where she'd once lived, maybe where she was born, it remained completely still. Not because it had settled, but because it had arrived. I stepped out. The cold touched me again, but gently this time. There was no wind, no rustling, only a strange warmth that came not from temperature, but from stillness. I walked around the vehicle slowly, my boots sinking slightly into the soft shoulder. My hands stayed at my sides. I didn't reach for the latch. I didn't open the rear door. I simply stood there, eyes on the house. A crow landed on the porch railing, its wings flaring once before folding tight. It didn't make a sound, just watched. The front window left side, second floor, was cracked open half an inch. The curtain behind it swayed ever so slightly, though there was no wind to move it. I felt no urge to call out, no impulse to investigate. Whatever had drawn us here had not done so to be acknowledged. It had done so to be completed, and in that moment, I understood. She hadn't been ready to leave. Not entirely. Something inside her, some echo, some flicker of presence, had resisted closure. Not from denial, not from fear, but from yearning. The kind that roots itself so deeply in a place that even death cannot unbind it without a final glance. Maybe she had grown up in that house. Maybe she had watched those trees from a bedroom window as a child. Maybe she'd once fallen in love on that porch, or spent summers baking things that filled the walls with sugar and spice. Maybe that swing had belonged to a daughter she no longer recognized. Maybe none of that was true, but it felt true. And in this work, feelings often matter more than facts. I don't believe in ghosts, not in the way people tell stories about them, but I do believe in echoes, in the way a place can remember, and in the way certain souls leave fingerprints on the world they loved, even if no one else notices, even if the people left behind don't care to look. I turned back toward the hearse. The casket was quiet, not in the way that objects are silent, in the way that something exhausted becomes still. There was no movement, no tension, no pulse in the air behind me, only peace. I stood for a moment longer, unsure whether I should say anything. A part of me wanted to some gesture of acknowledgement, a farewell, but I didn't speak. She didn't ask for words. She only asked to pass by, to see. I climbed back into the hearse and sat for a moment, watching the house grow smaller in the mirror. The crow had vanished. The curtain no longer moved. The road ahead narrowed into a line of bare trees and fading gravel. The cemetery waited beyond it, and the schedule would resume once I turned back onto the main road. But something inside me had shifted now, just as something inside the casket had calmed. I started the engine. The sound returned soft, familiar, steady. But now, it felt like it belonged again. As I drove away from Hickory Lane, the silence in the hearse felt different. It no longer pressed. It exhaled. The cemetery sat just over the ridge, tucked into the cradle of two shallow hills that curved around it like the worn hands of someone tired of holding grief. The trees were thinner here, the sky wider, and the wind had returned not harsh, but steady, brushing across the headstones like a voice too quiet to catch. I turned back onto the main road after leaving Hickory Lane behind, and for the first time that day, the casket didn't shift, didn't creak, didn't resist. The hearse rolled smooth beneath me, and the silence that had earlier felt crowded, thick with something unseen, now felt thinner, airier, like a room finally exhaled after someone had left it. The road that once felt too narrow now gave space. The pavement no longer seemed to pull, or lean, or hum in protest. Even the trees appeared to step back, giving way to the long stretch that led toward the gates. I didn't rush. The cemetery crew would be waiting. The daughter might be too. But I allowed the hearse to move as it wished, unhurried, with a rhythm that matched the stillness I now felt radiating from the back. It wasn't merely that the casket had stopped shifting. It was the quality of that stillness, the completeness of it. Before, each pause had felt like a held breath, a moment suspended between movement and resistance. Now it felt like something had settled into place, not just physically, but internally, like whatever had clung to the edge of the journey had finally found rest the moment we passed that old house. I thought of the photograph again, how it had slipped from the folder twice, how the ink had seemed to deepen with time, how the back read, "Do not forget," and how, without meaning to, I hadn't. I thought of the daughter, her posture, her phone, her lack of questions, and how grief manifests in the spaces we leave unspoken. How some children lose their parents long before death makes it official. I wondered if she'd even known the significance of that house, if it had ever come up in conversation, or if, like so many things between generations, it had remained unsaid, left to die quietly between holidays and obligations. A turn into the cemetery came gentle and wide, gravel lining both sides of the entrance, like crumbs scattered at the edge of a threshold. The iron gate hung open as it always did, one hinge tighter than the other, causing the left panel to remain stiff and the right to swing freely. I eased the hearse through, tires crunching low across the path. It curved toward the east section, where the burial had been scheduled. The crew was already there, 2 men in navy jackets with hands in their pockets. Heads turned slightly as I approached. They gave me the standard nods, the kind that aren't quite acknowledgement and not quite habit, just somewhere in between. I parked beside the plot, aligned the rear as I always do, set the brake, and shut off the engine. The stillness now was full, not empty, not eerie, just full, like a bowl that had finally stopped shaking and let its contents settle. I stepped out, the cold greeting me without hostility, and walked slowly to the back. One of the crewmen approached, but didn't speak. He waited, knowing better than to rush the rhythm. I opened the rear hatch. The casket was perfectly in place. The strap I'd added was still tight, still centered. The lid sat flush, the hinges untouched, the surface smooth. It hadn't moved a hair. Not during the detour. Not since the house. I stared at it for a moment before removing the strap, folding it carefully, and placing it back in the side compartment. The brass plate still held no name, no gates, just the shine of morning light reflecting the gray above us. Together, the crew and I slid the casket gently onto the lowering frame. It was heavier than I remembered, or maybe it just felt that way because of what it carried, an absence now complete, a silence now whole. We positioned it without words, adjusting as we always did, letting the rollers guide it into place. The daughter was there, standing a few yards away, coat drawn tight, hands in her pockets. She didn't approach. She didn't cry. She didn't look at the casket as it settled into place. She kept her eyes on the grass, then the sky, then the crew. I nodded once in her direction, a gesture of completion, and she offered a polite, almost imperceptible tilt of the head in return. Then she turned and walked away. No eulogy, no words, just a simple departure, as if she'd left a package where it was meant to be delivered and no longer felt the need to confirm its arrival. As the grounds team prepared the rest of the burial, I lingered by the hearse, one hand resting on the hood, the other in my coat pocket. The wind moved through the trees at the edge of the lot, whispering over the markers, tugging at the corners of a tarp, not yet weighed down. The air no longer carried the weight it had earlier. The smell of sugar and spice was gone. The presence was gone. But something remained, not haunting, not ominous, just something. A sense that the journey had mattered, that detours have reasons, that routes aren't always written on paper. Sometimes they're folded inside photographs. Sometimes they're stitched into memory so tightly that even death can't loosen them. As I made my final walk around the hearse, checking locks, scanning tires, brushing a few leaves from the windshield, I glanced once more toward the plot. A casket was gone from view, already lowered. The dirt waited beside the hole, quiet and ready. And above it all, the sky finally broke just a little, just enough to allow a sliver of sun to slip through and touch the corner of the brass plate one last time. Not a spotlight, not a blessing, just a moment of recognition. A nod, perhaps, and then it was gone. I climbed back into the hearse, closed the door, and started the engine. The vibration returned beneath my seat. The silence remained within me. I turned the wheel and began the slow, respectful path back through the gates. And this time, when I looked in the rearview mirror, I didn't expect to see movement. I didn't expect to hear sound. What I saw instead was a reflection of a cabin now empty, carrying nothing but peace and dust. And that for once, was enough. I didn't leave immediately. Something in me stalled as I neared the exit, as if some thread hadn't fully unspooled yet. The gates stood open just the same, but I let the hearse idle at the curve, where the cemetery road met the public one, the indicator ticking a rhythm against the quiet, like a soft metronome counting breaths. The burial was complete. The ground had taken her. The daughter had vanished before the last handful of soil had fallen. No words, no flowers, no backward glance, just absence replacing absence. A seamless transition. But I remained, still tethered to something unresolved. I shifted into park again and stepped out. The air had changed. Not colder, not warmer, just clearer. The kind of air that follows rain, even if it never rained. The kind that feels like something got rinsed clean, even if nothing looks different. I walked the gravel path back toward the east section, not to see the grave, not to say anything, but simply to feel the distance close between where I was and where I'd just been. That's when I saw him, Gerald, the groundsman. I'd known him for 15 years. We never spoke much, but he remembered every plot, every name, every story, if there was one. He stood near the freshly covered grave, shovel now leaning against a wheelbarrow, half filled with leftover soil. His hands rested on his hips, and when he turned to see me coming, his brow furrowed slightly, as if he had something to say he wasn't sure how to phrase. "She didn't want to be buried here," he said without waiting for a greeting. "Not here, anyway." His voice was low, not secretive, just hesitant. I stopped a few feet from him, watching the wind flatten the short grass near our feet. "What do you mean?" I asked. He shrugged, rubbed the back of his neck, and stared at the ground like he expected it to respond. "Daughter came in last week, arranged everything in a rush. No interest in service, no music, nothing. Just the logistics, paperwork, time slot, efficiency." But she mentioned, almost like an afterthought, that the old woman had always wanted to be laid to rest closer to where she grew up. Said it in passing, and ignored it. A pulse moved behind my eyes. "Did she say where?" Gerald nodded slowly. "Some house on Hickory Lane, 40-something. Didn't catch the full number. Said it used to be theirs, but those plots are long gone. That side of town doesn't even have an active cemetery anymore, and no permit to bury private." He glanced back toward the fresh mound. "She didn't push, didn't even ask. Just said too late now, and signed the form. I didn't respond. I didn't have to." I think Gerald saw it in my face, the small shudder that ran through my expression like a ripple beneath ice. That house, that photo, that sound, that stillness, it all lined up now, not like puzzle pieces clicking together neatly, but like shadows suddenly aligning in the same direction when the sun tilts just right. I looked back toward the horizon where the road curved away, toward the direction we'd come. The weight in the rear of the hearse, once uneasy and restless, had not stirred since we passed that place. Because that's where she wanted to stay. Not literally, perhaps, but spiritually, emotionally, psychically, if you believe in such things. Her body had arrived here, but her gaze, her pull, her longing, it had been aimed elsewhere. It had pulled the hinges, tilted the lid, whispered through the scent of baked memory, and opened windows. "She ever mention it to you?" Gerald asked suddenly. "Before today?" I shook my head. "Just the house in the photo. Found it by accident. The address was written on the back, and I ended up driving past it on the way here." He raised his eyebrows just a touch. "And after that?" I didn't answer directly. "She stopped moving," I said. That was enough. He understood. In our line of work, sometimes that's all the explanation you get, or need. He bent down and picked up the shovel. "We dig where they tell us," he muttered, almost to himself, "but they rest where they choose." He gave me a nod, not a goodbye, but a confirmation of something mutual, something known but unspoken, and turned back to his wheelbarrow. The rhythm of his work resumed. The day would go on. More names, more forms, more silence. I walked back to the hearse with that phrase circling in my head, like a phrase stuck in the grooves of an old record. They rest where they choose. Not always where they're placed, not always where we leave them, but where something deep inside them decides to settle. Maybe that's what the movement was, the soul resisting misplacement. Maybe it wasn't a haunting. Maybe it was a redirection, a final whisper. Not yet, not here, closer. Or maybe it was just gravity, hinges, road vibration, and coincidence. But I didn't believe that anymore. Inside the hearse, the engine ticked quietly in neutral. The rearview mirror held only sky and treetop snow. No movement, no flickers of shape or shadow. I sat there a while, watching the dirt dry around my boots, watching the wind comb the grass, until the clock reminded me of the next job waiting at the other side of town. Before shifting into drive, I looked back once more toward where the house on Hickory Lane would be, far beyond the trees and the ridge, beyond the routes approved by the office, beyond what the family wanted or planned. And for the first time all day, I felt something like peace. Not mine, hers. And it was enough. I didn't mean to pass by the house again. It wasn't part of the route, and the day was already edging toward late. The sun had begun its descent, not dramatically, but in that slow, sideways way that makes shadows grow across the road like quiet warnings. I had every reason to head back to the funeral home. Reports to file, the hearse to clean, the next day's prep to begin. But my hands didn't listen. They moved the wheel almost by instinct, curving toward the detour as naturally as a breath held too long and finally released. I told myself it was to return the photo, the one that had slid out of her file twice, now resting in the glove box. But I knew better. I needed to see the house again. Not as a professional, not as a driver, but as someone who had, for reasons unknown and uninvited, become a witness to something that didn't fit in forms or folders. Something that had slipped past the boundaries of the job. Hickory Lane was quieter now. The wind had softened, and the branches that earlier whipped against each other now only swayed gently, like the trees had stopped resisting and chosen to listen instead. I slowed as I neared number 43. The house stood just as before, modest, slightly tilted with time. The paint on its siding grayed into uniformity by decades of sun and indifference. No car in the driveway, no lights in the window, no signs of recent life. But it didn't feel abandoned. It felt paused, waiting. The same curtain still hung in the front window, thin lace, yellowed with age, unmoved by the wind. Yet as I stopped the hearse across the street and cut the engine, I felt something shift, not in the car, not in the air, but somewhere just behind my eyes. That quiet pressure of attention, like the moment you realize you've been watched for a while. I didn't move at first, just sat there, hands resting on the wheel, the hum of the engine fading into silence. The neighborhood remained still, not dead, just settled, and the house watched me back. It didn't blink, it didn't beckon, but it saw me. That much I was sure of. I reached across the seat and opened the glove box. The photo slid out easily, as if it had been waiting too. I held it again, the image of this same house, decades ago, in better color, crisper edges, freshly painted shutters, and a porch swing just barely caught in the frame. In the photograph, the window curtain was the same, or so it seemed. But what drew my eye wasn't the house this time. It was the woman in the corner, barely visible, faded with time and gloss, standing in the doorway with her hand on the screen, not looking at the camera, but somewhere off to the side, like she was already seeing past the lens and into something the rest of us had missed. I turned the photo over again. Hickory Lane, 43, written in looping script. Below it, in a different pen, a different hand, "Come home before I forget." I didn't know if the daughter had ever read that. Didn't know if she cared. But the words stuck like a splinter under the skin. I looked up from the photo and back at the window, and I swear to you, just for a moment, the curtain moved. Not dramatically, not fluttered, just shifted, enough to see the barest outline of something behind it. A face, maybe, a silhouette, The shape of someone standing still, as if waiting for someone to step out of a car, walk up the path, knock like they used to. My mouth dried. I blinked. The curtain settled again, flat and still. Nothing behind it now, but the quiet interior of a house long emptied. Or so I told myself. I didn't get out. Couldn't. This wasn't my story to finish. It had already ended once. Or maybe it hadn't. Maybe it just folded inward like old letters, sealed without ever being read. I placed the photo back into the glove box and closed it gently, turned the key. The hearse stirred back to life, the low purr of duty resuming. But as I pulled away, slowly, I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, not for traffic, not for safety, but for confirmation, for something I couldn't name. And there, in that mirror's narrow truth, the house remained still. Yet just before I turned the corner, before the trees took it from sight, I saw it again, the curtain, drawn back just an inch. Enough for someone to watch me leave, enough to say goodbye. The roads home were long and without sound. Not even the casket straps rattled in the back anymore. I didn't turn on the radio, didn't open the window. I just drove, hands steady, mind full, heart slowed to a rhythm that didn't belong to me. I've done hundreds of drives like that, hundreds of deliveries from the land of the living to the land of the remembered. Most are routine, some are sad, a few leave something behind, but every so often, one follows you, lingers, not like a ghost, not like a curse, but like a thread tied to the edge of your coat, too fine to notice, too strong to cut. That thread is still with me. I feel it when I pass side roads I'd never turn down, when I see windows with curtains drawn, when I hear the faint shift of weight where there shouldn't be any, not out of fear, out of memory, out of witness, because that day, a casket moved on its own, because that day, it stopped moving once it saw home, because that day, the dead didn't rest where they were told to, but where they needed to, and because sometimes, the last ride isn't about where we end up. It's about what we have to pass one last time before we finally let go.